Okay, we've gone live on YouTube, and in 4 minutes, I will start the webinar.
I went ahead and recorded to the cloud just in case.
Yeah.
How many folks do we have registered for the webinar, out of curiosity?
32.
Nice. Works for me. I mean, I'd do it for one, but yeah.
Well, and don't forget, it'll be on our YouTube channel too, so people will go back and watch it, and we can refer folks to that also. So it's out there. It's out there for a while.
Great.
Okay, 2 minutes.
I think this may be my first YouTube live. I've done a lot of Facebook lives.
Well, we used to do Facebook Live, and we had some challenges with it. And I would say we've been pretty, YouTube has been good. I mean, every now and then we have a glitch just getting going, but once we get it started, we haven't had problems.
Excellent.
Shelley, I'm going to go ahead and hit start webinar.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So if everybody is on and tuning in, we're going to start in just a minute. Shelley is taking care of getting us lined up with YouTube.
Okay, it is 6 o'clock.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our April preservation conversation, Archaeology in Your Backyard, Discoveries at the Doty McAlpine House with Dr. Andrew Beaupre. I'm Patricia Blick, Executive Director of the QQA, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo, our Membership and Events Coordinator. I would like to thank our donors as well as our corporate and individual members. We are able to continue our educational programs with your support. You can find a list of our corporate members on our website at quapaw.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work that we do. Please go to qualpaw.com to join for as little as $35 per year or to make a donation. If you join or donate at the $100 level, you will receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt. Before we get started with our talk tonight, I just wanted to take an opportunity to let you know that we are reviving the May Day basket tradition as a fundraiser this spring. We are selling an adult basket and a children's basket. They will be ready for pickup the afternoon of Friday, April 30th, or the morning of Saturday, May 1st. And we will also deliver them within 15 miles of Current Hall the morning of Saturday, May 1st. You can go to qualpaw.com for more information and to order them. And this is in conjunction with Celebrate 501, an initiative of the Downtown Little Rock Partnership. And I also, went too far there. I also wanted to make sure that everyone saw the information about our QQA Chronicle Digital Archive. We received a grant from the Division of Arkansas Heritage and hired Advantage Archive to scan all of the back issues of the Chronicle that we had from 1970 to 2005. It is a great tool for researching people, properties, and events. Be sure to check it out. You can find it at qualpaw.com, and we are loving this new research tool. And just a reminder, before I introduce our speaker, that we will take questions at the end of the talk. So please type your questions in the chat area of Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube Live, you can chat them, add them to the comment section, and Shelley and I will go back and forth asking questions of our speaker. So on to tonight's preservation conversation. I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Andrew Beaupre. Andrew Beaupre received his PhD from the College of William & Mary in 2017. He is the survey's research station archaeologist for UAPB and research assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. He has been interested in archaeology since his first visit to an excavation in the 4th grade. His current research interests include historical archaeology, culture contact and colonialism, landscape archaeology, heritage studies, and public archaeology. He has excavated throughout the eastern seaboard of the United States, in Canada, and as far away as Australia. Prior to joining ARAS, Dr. Beaupre was the inaugural postdoctoral teaching and research fellow in the McCormick Center for the Study of the American Revolutionary Era at Siena College in Loudonville, New York. He has also taught courses at the University of Vermont, several community colleges, and has worked as a cultural resource management archaeologist. And of course, we are thrilled to have him in the Governor's Mansion Historic District and welcoming here tonight. Please join me as we welcome Dr. Beaupre.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. That's a great introduction. I'm gonna share my screen here so that you have an opportunity to see the presentation. All right. Can you see that there? A thumbs up. Awesome. So thank you very much for the invite and thank you for the introduction. That was lovely. This is a little bit of a departure from my usual kind of archaeological topic, and we're going to talk about that really throughout the lecture tonight. And so it is titled Archaeology in Your Backyard, Discoveries at the Doty McAlpine House. I thought, that there could have been different titles for this talk. I think Archaeology in Your Backyard is a good way to start the title, but it could be a new home, a honey-do list, and backyard archaeology in Little Rock. That kind of sums up what we're talking about, but really has a lot to do with the musings of a frustrated COVID-bound archaeologist. And so when the world shut down last year, a lot of my work with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey shut down as well. A lot of my outreach work and a lot of my in-person work with the people of Arkansas. And so an archaeologist being separated from the dirt is not a good thing. And so, this was a little bit of I wanted to give you a little bit more background and thank you very much, Patricia, for giving me such a great introduction. A lot of this was already covered, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a background of who I am before we get into the topic. And so I was born and raised in Vermont, and a small town in Vermont, like a really small town. So I used to say that there were 327 people. I used to say there were 326 people because I wasn't home whenever I was away from the town of Morgan, Vermont, really small place. Went to the University of Vermont, and then focused my career on historical archaeology, but really of the French contact era. And a lot of the work I do down here is now associated with Arkansas Post and French contact in Arkansas. And that's how I focused my master's and PhD and my postdoc, was that I pushed the topic of American Revolutionary era to include French involvement, and then came down here. And so a recurring theme in my most recent work as well is my children. And so there's my son leaning up against me in an excavation in New York. This was the second time I think he was actually in the field and using daddy as a backrest while we're doing work. But before I get too far into it, I also want to just take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the survey and what that is. And so for those of you who don't know, the Arkansas Archaeological Survey functions as a branch unit of the University of Arkansas system. And I came down here to really focus on that French contact in Arkansas, but my job is really, as the UAPB station archaeologist, I'm responsible, or the point of contact for the state of Arkansas for all of these counties you get in the light orange here. So the station's actually at UAPB in Pine Bluff in Jefferson County. But if people have an archaeological question or concern, or something's happening in Pulaski, Lono, Prairie, Monroe, Phillips, Lee, or Arkansas counties, in addition to Jefferson, then I'm the guy that you go to. And so we want to make sure, as the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, that part of our mission is archaeological research, and that's where that research professor at Fayetteville comes in. But really, it's about outreach and bringing archaeology to the people of Arkansas. I'm very fond of saying I'm a public servant. I work for you. I'm a research professor, but I'm an outreach guy, and I'm the guy who answers the phone if you call, very, very honestly. And so when you have questions about archaeology, whether it's associated with a historic home or just something you find on the roadside, that's what we're here for. We've broken the state up into these pieces, and we're available to you. And so, like I said, a lot of that work wasn't happening. But before I came and moved to Arkansas, I am from that little town of Vermont, and I was a lover of historic architecture as well. So my wife and I bought a historic home, which is a very lovely photo of the home before either of us were born. And then we bought a home that was in less than awesome shape. It's actually a built duplex. It was built by two brothers, which is actually kind of cool because I bought it with one of my brothers, and his family had a space in one side and my family had a space in the other, but it needed a lot of love and rehab. So we bought this house, and we spent just about 2 years updating it and keeping the character of the original home and getting it just to really kind of putting a nice polish back on this beautiful girl. And then what do? Up and move to Arkansas, where I'm going to have to start the process all over again. And so when the move was happening to Little Rock, this was in August, so August of 2019, before COVID started, we lived here for a year, and then really started to look for a permanent home in Little Rock. And in doing that, we got down to really being interested in the properties of the Quapaw Quarter and historic downtown Little Rock, and came up with 2 property finalists. I don't know if anybody recognizes this house. It's on Gaines Street, absolutely gorgeous Victorian that has been painstakingly restored. And then the Doty McAlpine house on the other side, which is a bungalow, not something I was familiar with at all. The style of architecture, really kind of rehabbing it and what that was like. But we said, okay, the house this is on Gaines Street here, absolutely beautiful, done inside. And at that point, we have a 4-year-old son and another child on the way at that point. And we were like, we're only going to do damage to this house. It's in beautiful condition. It's been painstakingly restored. We're going to hurt it probably. And so we thought, hey, let's try another adventure project. And we ended up purchasing the Doty McAlpine house, which I hope you can hear. I don't know if this will come through, but that is my son announcing that we bought a new house, standing on the front steps when we did that. So we purchased the Doty McAlpine house here on Center Street. and immediately started to do a little bit of research on the property as historic property owners. Again, not really coming from New England and coming from a kind of a different colonial architectural tradition. Where I grew up in a house actually in that town of Morgan that was built in 1790. And so all of the beams were still hand hewn and had bark on them in the basement and that kind of a thing. Thinking of a house that was built circa 1910, 1912, like the Doty McAlpine house was, didn't really strike me as historic to begin with. Quite honestly, it's a very different idea when you move from east of the Mississippi and East Coast to west and what that was like. But then I started doing some research about this. And so here we are on the historic map of the downtown Governor's Mansion neighborhood. We're number 143 there, which is listed as a contributing property to the neighborhood, the Governor's Mansion Historic Neighborhood. And so there it's listed as built about 1911. I don't know how accurate that is. We might be a little off with that. And when the initial inventory was done, it was actually owned by 2 or 3 owners previous. Well, when we got our hands on it, she had been neglected a little bit. And so the outside had been kept up. The inside just needed a little love. We had the tornado come through this neighborhood. And so this house had been hit by that. And there were some issues with some plaster and issues with some molding. And this is a dear friend who volunteered to do some ceiling painting and was on a ladder. And so there was a labor of love to take care and restore this beautiful house, which is coming really well. This is the master bedroom now, looking out back as we've started to rehab it. And actually what the room I'm sitting in right now looks like when it's not office and / playroom at the same time. And so in that process really started to gain an appreciation for this style of architecture, and started to gain a little bit of an understanding of the history of the house. Being an archaeologist, I wanted to make that jump. I wanted to make that jump from just caring for the standing structure to starting to think about the lives of the individuals who built the house and lived in the house before my family. And then the responsibility that we have as the current owners to really care for it and bring the home forward. More as caretakers of the property, and so the building and the entire property, and thinking of it moving forward. And so the register form, the original one here, mentions that initially the home was built by Charles L. Doty, a clerk for Little Rock Railway and Electric Company. And then in 1918 to the early 30s, Kenneth McAlpine and family, who worked at a dry goods store, lived here and moved in. And so I started to think about the fact that, these are the individuals that put, quite possibly blood, sweat, and tears into building the property and getting it to where it was in the early 1930s. I mean, post-war years, things have changed a lot. You can see the interior of the house has changed quite a bit. But those individuals that were the initial owners kind of started to come into my mind when looking at the actual archaeology of the property. And out back, initially walking around when we were looking at the house to purchase, these kind of brick and concrete footings showed up in the backyard. Actually, I tripped over one to begin with. I'm not exactly the most graceful sometimes, but these started to show up. And also, just so you know, the archaeologist convention, when you don't have your complete photo set up with the north arrow, is to use your trowel to point toward general north or grid magnetic north. So these are both kind of looking, and they have mirror images of this kind of L shape. These are 2 opposite corners of what we call an archaeological feature. When an artifact is on the ground, and it's when it's immobile, we call it an archaeological feature. And so these brick footings make part of an archaeological feature that was showed up in the backyard. You can see them there outlined in red, a little bit easier. Right? Well, the reason that I started to kind of delve into these more had a lot to do with my wife's vision for landscaping the backyard. And so when I started thinking about apple trees, I really was into the fact that the environment here in Arkansas, the growing season is so exciting as someone who's a gardener as well, coming from an area where our summer is like 25 minutes long. Literally, we have snow on the ground for 7 months a year where I'm from. And so this is a very, very different thought. So I started thinking about being able to grow our own food and transitioning the landscape in the backyard, at least, to an edible landscape, and started thinking about apple trees. I started thinking about this lush idea of apple trees, and was very taken by the Arkansas black apple, right, which is this variety that comes from Arkansas, actually Northwest Arkansas. So it can be a little tough to grow in the Little Rock market from what I'm told. But I started thinking about these ideas of, our own fresh grown fruit and keeping this kind of feeling of the homestead going in this little environment. And so that's my dream. And in actuality, what I got was kind of a funny little stick that you put in the ground, right? I mean, like when you buy an apple tree at, I think this is, let me get this right. The Arkansas Black, I think, came from Hokett's. The shout out there. There's a couple of different places that we frequent, but putting this in the yard, I had to do a few things, right? I had to start thinking about how the original landscape of the house was put together, but also had to start thinking about actually putting a hole in the ground. It's an archaeologist. It's something I feel very comfortable with, but wasn't really considering the archaeological resources that were going to turn up. So I almost, though, treated this Arkansas black apple and then a fig, which went in also in the back, treating these holes to dig to place landscaping as test pits. In archaeology, when we are investigating a new archaeological resource, we dig a test pit. And generally that's a 50 by 50 centimeter hole that's on a grid or somehow associated with a direction system so they can be geo-referenced and we can know what we recover from these archaeological investigations. Now, we are well into COVID by this point when I have decided that I am so frustrated by not doing any archaeology that I'm going to turn my landscaping into little archaeology. So I have the test pit 1 would be the apple tree. Test pit 2 is the fig tree. Test pits have then since grown in my backyard too as more landscaping has taken place. But as soon as we started putting these holes in the ground, artifacts started popping up. And again, due to COVID, you do have my photo scale there, but the nice plain white background is actually some flannel sheet. It is not your typical photo setup that we would use in my lab, but since my lab was closed at UAPB and I couldn't go there, you have a nice white flannel sheet as the backdrop. And so as these artifacts started to turn up, it really made me reflect more on these initial owners of the property, since as an archaeologist, I can look at these pretty quickly and identify them as late 19th, early 20th century ceramics, meaning that the people that were living here in the gap. Like these artifacts are actually from that gap in the centuries between the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. And so I can look at these, and some of these may have been heirloom pieces that were brought in with the initial owners of the property and broken and discarded. And there's almost an emotional tie that can be seen with that too, because some of these are rather expensive pieces of ceramic, even at the turn of the century, right? And then some of them are much more industrial and basic ceramics, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, and how that kind of gets us to understand the people that lived here before us. But the more holes that I dug, the more of these artifacts turned up. And the more of I started to think and reflect on our responsibility, again, as members of an urban environment now. I've never lived in an urban environment, nor done a lot of archaeology in an urban environment. So backyard archaeology, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to Google it, right? And if you don't, I mean, come on, that's just like gut reaction. I guess I'm a digital native. I guess I'm technically a millennial by like a year, though I'm not crazy about that title. But the first thing that we do in my generation is we Google something, right? And as a professional archaeologist that has spent the majority of my adult life studying archaeology, I really started to get worried by what came back when you Google backyard archaeology. With the exception of this Life in the Finger Lakes thing to begin with, what you're really looking at is in individuals who shouldn't really be doing archaeology, but decided to dig a hole in their backyard and decided that they were archaeologists. It's always a danger when you kind of go down that road. It's like you go to your doctor, you go to your physician, you have an issue, and your physician tells you, please don't Google it. I got a bump and I Googled it and it could be cancer, right? Well, we don't like that as archaeologists either when someone Googles it and thinks that they can come up with that. But when you go down that road, you start to see the reflection of that. And it brought me back to looking at New England. In the last few years before I left, there were two incredibly important archaeological sites where somebody thought that they could be an archaeologist and dig them, and they made pretty large news as just destroying an archaeological context, not knowing how to record a site properly, not knowing really what to do, and ended up destroying pieces of history that we'll never get back. In this case, incredibly important archaeological resources that were on private property, and there was no stopping people from destroying them. So I didn't want to go down that road. But the term we use when we're really investigating urban backyards is urban archaeology, right? It is a backyard, but the more professional sounding term is urban archaeology. And so that takes you into, when you Google that, takes you down a different road of the kind of archaeology where people were interested in their backyard, and how is that going to be investigated by a professional archaeologist? Now, in my case, I could skip the step on the guy in the middle, that's fine. But it's some really interesting reading out there for anybody who's interested in the archaeology of their own backyard, their own property, to look at urban archaeology and what questions are being asked by these archaeologists and what answers we're able to get from them. And that's really what archaeology is all about. More than just digging holes and finding artifacts, it's about asking really in-depth, good questions about the people of the past, and then finding a scientific method to answer that question, right? And so I reflect back to Little Rock, urban archaeology in Little Rock. There are some great examples of archaeological context in the city that haven't fully been explored or kind of are on their way to that. We have the Ham Museum, right? We have a number of house museums. We have Kern Hall, right, that is associated with the Quapaw War II. We have a number of these different properties where either buildings are moved and we have an architectural history aspect, or some of the buildings are in place and we can start thinking about the archaeology of downtown Little Rock that way, right? We have things like the Old State House Museum, where there's a lot of Arkansas history that happened on that ground, and it's protected, right? It's inside a museum, the grounds are protected. There's a possibility for understanding a bit more of the archaeology there. I love going into that museum and hearing it. The first time I went through about the Bowie knife fight on the floor, where the Speaker of the House is insulted by someone else, I think, and they fight with knives to the death or something of that, or somebody gets shot. Fascinating, right? Fascinating. Those are the big stories that everybody knows. Archaeology can kind of sometimes get at those background stories, ones that aren't told as often. Like, I don't know how many people are aware that the original state prison of Arkansas is underneath where the Capitol building is now. I don't know if I'm letting too much of a secret out of the bag with that one, but there's a whole archaeological resource underneath that building of, an early prison when the Capitol was down at the old State House building, right? That area, that was Prison Hill, right? Kind of set outside of town, little ways, and easy to be watched. But then also, things like Fort Steele and the Union lines that are down across downtown Little Rock as well. There's a lot of really interesting history that's yet to be uncovered in archaeology. Now, Fort Steele and the Union fortifications and Confederate fortifications, both in Little Rock, have been a little bit investigated by my predecessors with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, but not crazy amount yet. Anyway, we got that. And then we got me in my backyard because it's COVID. And so then I have my son here, Teddy, as scale. He's standing on the corner of one of those footings. We're going to jump back to talking about that archaeological feature. In this case, there's my fig test pit 2 and my Arkansas apple tree test pit 1. And those footings again. And how do those foot together? How does this tell the story of my house? What's the deal? Because those trees that I place those test pits are either right outside the footing rectangle or just inside it. The fig is inside that, and the black apple tree is outside it, right? And there's that nice kind of general outline of where those footings are in my backyard. So I'm going to try and figure this out, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to go to my survey. And when I purchased the property, I was given a survey, and it said that in the backyard here behind the home, there's a 20 by 20 or 18 by 20 asphalt poured area. Well, there's no asphalt there back there now. But when the survey was taken, that was present, right? So I was like, okay, asphalt, these brick footings, how is this tying together, right? There's another kind of zoom together of that little asphalt piece on the north edge of my property, right? So how is this going to fit together? So I want to start looking at historic maps, right? We're going to do all the best. As historical archaeologists, we're going to do the best research we can to go back and look at what the topography looked like before we became custodians of a property. In this case, we can look at the Sanborn insurance maps, right? Fire maps that are set up, right? You can find ourselves here. This is a little bit of a zoom in. What's now the Governor's Mansion, those of you I'm sure you know, was the Institute for the Blind before it became the Governor's Mansion territory. We're zooming in right down here on Center Street. And we have 3 eras of maps to kind of really look at. 1897, I'm going to circle where the property is. Here is where the Doty McAlpine house will be, but it's not there yet. My neighbor to the south, house is present, but actually what is now the Doty McAlpine lot was part of this larger lot that belonged to my neighbor to the south, right? Well, in this, we have a little bit of a garage space back here. So maybe these footings are associated with that garage from 1897 or some sort of outbuilding from 1897. Right? Well, by 1913, now these maps, because of the way that they're drawn, they change orientation and location. So I apologize for that. So I circled the resource again for you here. But by 1913, here is that neighbor of mine to the south. The property lines have been cut and the Doty McAlpine house has been built, or at least part of it has been built. Zooming forward in time a little bit more to 1939, there's the Doty McAlpine house again, and we see some sort of outbuilding behind it, right? So here are my options as I'm looking at it as an archaeologist. These are kind of the historic resources I have to work with. Which one of these is associated with my rectangular feature in the backyard? Well, I came up with more than likely probably this 1939 era building. Well, then you take that map, rotate a little bit, zoom it in, and here we are. And the great thing about these Sanborn maps is that they give us a little key that tells us a bit about the building, right? Because the purpose of these maps originally were for fire insurance, right? So they want to know which buildings are going to burn down, how fast they're going to burn, how much it's going to cost to insure them, right? And whether you should insure any of these buildings. Well, here's the Doty McAlpine house with the 2 stories, a front porch, back porch. And there's our backyard area with a little A on it and a dot and a 1. Well, our key tells us that that means this is a 1-story building. An A means it's associated with an auto house or private garage in the back. And a little dot is going to indicate that it's actually a composite shingle, probably like an asphalt shingle that's on top of the roof at that point. So I started to think about, well, what's this piece of property look like in 1939, right? You know, if you're going to build something associated with the bungalow, how is that going to be placed? Is it going to be like, you know, these are just stock images from the internet when you say bungalow garage, right? Something that's in flat roof, is it got a pitched roof? You know, what was the total milieu of the property? Well, that's again all well and good, and started to tell those stories. But when I started thinking about the artifacts themselves, maybe they're not directly associated with that garage, right? We know the garage is probably built, it's got to be built somewhere between 1913 and 1939, 1940, right? Or before 1939. Some of these artifacts are telling a story that's a bit older than that, which means they probably predate the construction of the garage, and whoever built the garage built it right on top of where these artifacts had been placed. Now, in the days before central trash, and before I rolled my wheelie bin to the curb and the city of Little Rock came out and took the claw and dumped it in the back, which is incredibly entertaining, by the way, for a toddler during COVID as well, to stand in the front window and watch the claw, right? And an adult too, let's be frank. The story of what happens to your trash is, quite frankly, new stuff comes in the front door, old stuff goes out the back door. Now, archaeologists, we refer to that as a sheet midden. When people throw things and kind of sprinkle them around a backyard, we call it a sheet midden. Midden for trash pit. Sheet, meaning it's spread out in a sheet, as opposed to a mound midden, which is in a mound. Really exciting terms, right? But I imagine that some of these artifacts then predated that garage or were associated and moved because of the construction of the garage. You dig a hole, you put the footing in, you move some of these artifacts around, right? Well, some of those artifacts, again, can tell a neat story. And so I'm going to zoom in a little bit here on one of my pieces of ceramic that was recovered that has a maker's mark. As an archaeologist, again, that's going to tell us a neat little story. We're going to grab onto that. And we're going to say, okay, that's going to tell us about manufacture. It's going to tell us about location of manufacture. It's going to tell us about company. And in this case, it's going to tell us about actually what kind of wares, and it puts us right in that target date, right around when the house was built, that this piece of ceramic, relatively inexpensive. The term porcelain is used, but it's not really porcelain. It's not porcelain in the valuable, clear, high-fired clay sense, but the term porcelain in terms of a dishware piece, right? Utilitarian, inexpensive piece of dishware that was broken and found its way thrown out back, right? Which again brought me back to think about both the Doty and McAlpine families, which were quite frankly of a middling type, right? We've got a clerk who worked at a dry goods store, is Mr. McAlpine, and before that, Mr. Doty was some sort of clerk or worker, depending on the different records, at the electric company, railroad company, right, or the railroad. So then I started to look a little bit more into some more of these shards of what we call milk glass, Depression era glass, and that puts us right at the turn of the century, a little into the 1920s. Neat little artifact. I don't know if anybody's ever seen one of these. I hadn't until I started doing a little more research. You put them all together and you get a round glass disc. Has kind of a neat little ridge profile. When you look at that, and I hope somebody out there will type into the chat window and claim the ability to know what this artifact was. I didn't, like I said. Clean it all up and you look at it. It looks a lot like this. This is actually, it's made by the Boyd's company, and it's they called them porcelain, but they're really glass, a liner for a canning jar lid. And so right at this turn of the century, they didn't have the tin with the nice kind of plastic seal and rubber integrated canning jar cap lid that if anybody who cans today uses. They had pre the invention of this lovely lid. This is actually a section of a compound lid where the glass piece sat inside of a zinc ring. You can see the zinc ring up here. Before that, you could either have a whole glass top, which didn't fit very well, didn't seal very well, and the rubber was always cracking and moving on it. Not the bale style that some people still use today that are really kind of rare and esoteric, but it was a different type of glass lid that had to fit on top of the ball jar, and the jar was made specifically for that lid. They broke a lot, weren't very practical, didn't work well. Well, then somebody came up with these tin lids, but the problem with that is the zinc is a very soft metal that corrodes very easily and is always in contact with your food. And like our tin cans now are coated on the inside to keep your food from getting the tinny taste, all of your food that you home canned in these jars had a tinny taste from this zinc lid. So until Mr. Boyd patented this ceramic lid that actually went between the metal lid and the food, there wasn't that kind of a gap. He solved this problem, patented it, and it quickly made home canning much more accessible to the American public. More people wanted to eat home canned food, and more people felt comfortable doing that. And there was a big explosion in home canning at the end of the 19th century. And moving into the 20th century, it was sold to people as a technological advancement. This is the same time we're getting electric toasters, and people are deciding that they can home water bath canned food that they can grow in their own backyards, or they can buy in the summertime when food is cheap and put it away for that rainy day. Again, making me think about these individuals who are of lower economic status that they're living in this house, right? Or as it's blowing up, becoming something that not just poor people are doing and eating tinny food no matter what, but moving toward this idea of a middle-class housewife finding the technological advancement of caring for her own food and growing her own food. Also, there's kind of a seedy underbelly story to these. The caps were easily reused and a little bit tougher than just the tin ones, and they stood up a little bit better to when people started making bootleg booze during Prohibition in their backyards. And so there's a lot of discussion of lumber camp archaeology up north where alcohol was forbidden, but all of a sudden there's this big influx of canning jars that come in, and the question of whether booze is being smuggled in the lumber camps, and in this case being hidden by housewives in these canning jars during Prohibition and kind of sliding it under the radar in the 1930s. So it's kind of interesting little seedy underbelly discussion. Anyway, there's a much more longer story about this. I was able to write this, the Boy's canning jar, porcelain lined canning jar lid is the artifact of the month on the Arkansas Archaeological Survey's webpage. If you're interested in any of these stories, it's really neat. We do this once a month. Every month, there's a new artifact of the month from around the state of Arkansas, some prehistoric, some historic. I give you a neat little story about artifacts that are all recovered within the state of Arkansas and tell you a little story about those. So check that out on the Arkansas Archaeological Survey's website. So just kind of wrapping up here toward the end, and a picture of my son running away in the backyard. I wanted to kind of have an opportunity, and again, I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you folks today about the responsibility that we have and kind of bringing it back to that issue. There are stories of the people who lived in our homes in Arkansas and on Little Rock before us, and those stories don't often get told. And we do our best to protect and restore these historic homes, which again, we consider it our responsibility too, right? We have the ability, we have the responsibility to care for these homes for the future. Well, there are those stories that are available and accessible through the archaeology as well. And so I wanted to leave you with a little anecdote about my son the other day when I was actually sitting up here, and I know Patricia and Shelley heard this story before and indulge me, I apologize, but is sitting up here and I was working at my desk, and my son, there's a little landing halfway down the stairs, and my son ran in and he said, "Daddy, Daddy, 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 I need you." And I said, "Okay," you know, I jump up and I go talk to him. I'm like, "What's wrong, buddy?" And he's like, "I found an artifact, but I didn't touch it, and I left it where it is in the backyard so that you can look at it and we can decide if it's important enough to be recorded," right? And so, I mean, poor kid, he gets this drilled into his head, right, as the son of an archaeology professor. But something I wanted to give you the takeaway is that, you know, we're all going to dig in our gardens in Little Rock, and every one of us has these artifacts in our backyard. If you live in the Quapaw Quarter, if you have a historic property, if you live in the Heights or Hillcrest or any of these, not only do you have the possibility of having European or Euro-American artifacts underneath your property, you also have the possibility, Quapaw Quarter, right? We have the possibility of Native American artifacts as well, right? And that's the kind of thing where it's another resource to do with your property that you need to care for. I'm not telling you not to dig any holes in your backyard, but think about this when it happens. Even when you put, you know, a new planting, a new apple tree, a new whatever in your backyard, a new garden. Start thinking about the way that you're going to, you know, take care of those stories. Pick up the phone and give me a call. I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to come over and show you a little bit about those artifacts. You know, the way that we are mitigating the situation is we actually built above ground beds for vegetables now and are only putting the trees in the ground and cutting down the number of holes. We're actually digging into what we call the archaeological context. That's the way that, you know, my family's handling it. Again, we're a little in tune to that. But it's part of my job as your archaeologist here for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey for Pulaski County to be the voice on the other end of the line. So please, you know, email me, call me. If you have concerns, you're interested, you know, what's going on with the archaeology of your property. If you want to help tell that story of the homes that you're caring for, we'd be happy to help. So with that, thank you very much for listening. Thank you to the association for having me in the survey, for employing me, my patient family, and being an attentive audience. Thank you very much.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for that presentation. And your house is adorable, and your son is adorable. I'm glad he has been well trained by you as what to do with artifacts. But I guess I'll just ask some of those questions. You know, when do you know when you should or should not call you? And you know, as a preservation organization, we're sensitive to you know. Removing artifacts, but other folks may not know, and we could run into the same thing. And I appreciate that you said you are our archaeologist and that you will assist us if we need it. But how do you know? How do you know when it's the right time to call?
You know, I kind of get the feeling that you just kind of do. I think everybody knows you got to be careful in your yard anyway. You're going to end up with little bits of metal. You're going to end up with little bits of glass. You're going to get cut. So there's a level of that as well. Tetanus shots are a real deal in my profession. And so, so just kind of you're always aware that you're wearing gardening gloves, that kind of thing. But when you find an artifact that, has writing on it, looks cool, has printing on the ceramic, it's not just a piece of broken bottle glass or broken window glass that we run into every day, or something that, walking around, I just, took a walk for my afternoon walk with the dog around, and there's broken glass in the street, right? You stop, you pick it up. That's different than these historic pieces that are sticking out, and it also is a volume issue. If you're digging in your backyard and that was rather this, this collection of artifacts, it's a rather high volume that I was turning up from a small hole. This is just a handful of what we recovered, but you dig a hole in the ground, and if you're getting shovels and shovels of artifacts, that's definitely a time to pick us up and call us, because you're probably in either the midden dump where everybody decided that they get a little hole in the corner and fill it up. You could also be in a privy. Let's not forget that there's a time when Little Rock does not have plumbing. So you could be digging in a privy, and aside from the health concerns, most of that should be eroded away and should be biodegraded. A lot of people would throw things down the toilet. That's like a ubiquitous thing in American history, or in world history rather. You don't want something, you throw it down the toilet, whether the toilet is an outhouse or whether the toilet is, hooked to the city plumbing. People threw some really weird and toxic stuff away. So if you think you're in a privy, you're getting a lot of weird artifacts and things mixed together, that's definitely a red flag to stop and call somebody, because we're talking about like syringes would be in there, or patent medicine bottles that still have leached into the soil, that kind of stuff that you really want to avoid.
Very interesting. Okay, I hadn't thought about, we always talk about interesting things that are found in privies, but I hadn't thought about toxic types of things. So that's a good point. The other thing I was just going to mention too is, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the QQA owns the Woodruff House, which we have on the market. And of course, folks are interested in purchasing it. We have it stable and secure. But we always talk about that, that the house was modified, that there were accessory buildings, outbuildings there. If you have a situation where you have a significant historic property, what would be the appropriate steps to follow if you have an opportunity to do investigations? I know, again, it's private property, but it could be very telling about at least the Woodruff House, that original front elevation, which got switched to the north side at some point, and the outlines of those what really would have been an L on the house, which is no longer there. How would you go about doing an investigation like that?
Sure. I think too, it's just, you folks as owners of the Woodruff property, but anybody who owns one of the historic properties, knowledge is definitely power, right? And so doing that background research, those Sanborn maps of Little Rock are all available on the Library of Congress website. They're 5 clicks away from the Library of Congress main page.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, because we learned the other day that CALS also has a collection of the Sanborn maps too. And Shelley and I have played with that, and they're pretty easy to use as well. So I'll put in a plug for CALS also.
Absolutely. They're easy to use. And what's neat about the ones that you can get them in paper or the updated digital copies is that this is a company, right, that was making these maps for their own purposes, for selling insurance and for managing fire insurance, which means that they were constantly updating those books and actually physically pasting over the previous pages. If property lines changed, new houses were built, outlines of houses changed, you can go, and if you can get a physical copy of these atlases, where you'll see, it looks like a little bit of an index card is pasted over and a new house outline is drawn. Some really neat research you can do. And so you might think you have the 1939 edition, but you actually have the 39 updated to 54. So, do your research, look at those outlines. Those are great examples, original plat maps as well, that are going to give you property lines no matter where your house is. That's some interesting stuff. So have that knowledge. Then, if you're looking at restoring a property, you're looking at some of these larger kind of projects, it is always good to give us a call. Now, we don't do necessarily larger projects like that in conjunction with restoration, unless it's, there's like a level at which we, have you hire private contractors, right? But we can offer an opinion, and that's what we do. Now, there's a colleague of mine who had worked at the Monticello station, right? Monticello, whichever one is the opposite one that's, the one down south here in Arkansas.
Right. In Arkansas, it's going to be Monticello. In Virginia, it will
Monticello.
be Monticello. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
like it said,
So
it's
there you go.
Monticello. In Virginia, it's Monticello.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
She had done a really long and in-depth project at the Taylor Plantation outside of Monticello. And that's a really great example of historic house architecture in Arkansas. She has a book coming out. It'll be a little bit now. It's going to be with our press at the University of Arkansas. It's our imprint, rather, with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. There'll be a public book out that talks about house archaeology that they were doing in association with the school to restore that property for, it's actually now an event space for the school. So there's a really great example of that to see how those projects are done. Another really easy one to look at is when you have, oh, one second. My house is very much lived in. When you have...
No, and it's after hours too, so we appreciate you taking family time to spend it with us.
No worries, no worries. So when you have some of this work being done, if you have people coming in that are going to break ground on your property and you own a historic property, that's the kind of thing where you can ask us to come and be present when someone's doing site work and take a look and see if we think that there's going to be any archaeological remains there, or there's an indication to us that it's been destroyed previously. And again, then I can offer an opinion at that point that says, hey, you really need to hire a contractor if you want to investigate this fully. And there are companies that do that, that do archaeological contracts that are out there for preservation purposes, for really restoring properties the way that the archaeological imprint says they were built.
Well, I appreciate that guidance. We, one of the folks who was interested in seeing the Woodruff House, they asked about the slave quarters, which are shown on a bird's eye map. And we don't believe it's on the current property that we still own, but nonetheless in the vicinity, of course. But anyway, that's good guidance. But we'll definitely follow up with you if we move ahead with the sale of the property, because I think it could be pretty interesting too. Shelley, did you have any questions on your end on the YouTube?
No questions on YouTube. Okay,
I'll do a double check on chats. I don't know that we had any questions on chat, but a comment of I greatly enjoyed this. Thank you. But I don't know who it is because it just says Galaxy tablet. Well, I'm gonna.
To add to your point about the quarter, I apologize for interrupting there, but just to kind of jump back to this Woodruff House discussion. A lot of those stories too are the ones that have left to be told about the enslaved individuals that are associated with some of these historic homes. And the outdoor kitchens, the slave quarter spaces, the servant quarter spaces that really aren't fully investigated or aren't restored. And those are some of the stories that we really kind of need to look at telling. And there's a big boom in archaeology, historical archaeology right now that focuses on that African-American experience through their kind of archaeological remains as well.
Right. And we think that there is an opportunity to interpret that part of the story, which is not well represented, unfortunately, but true. We're getting a lot of good comments, and everyone's happy that we now have an archaeologist we can call who lives in our own neighborhood. So be careful there, especially since we know where you live. I am going to just close us down with a couple of announcements. So I'm going to close your sharing and open my sharing again. So we'll squeeze back over here to announcements. Oops. Let's do this one. And I'm just going to say personally, one of my favorite items that you shared is that the glass disc for the mason jar. My grandmother was a big canning person. And of course, we grew up with those rings and those inserts, but I never knew there was a glass one that had been used at some point or another. So that's quite interesting. And she learned how to can through the extension service. She was with Brady Homemaker Club, which is over 100 years old. So I wonder if there's even some story, tied with some of the homemaker extension clubs that have been in Little Rock for many, many years, over a century. But nonetheless, that's my personal interest about what you said. And I'll go on to just remind everybody that we will have another preservation conversation next month on May the 13th at 6 p.m. Homes of Architects in Greater Little Rock, and Mason Toms is going to be our presenter. So we're excited and looking forward to that. And he's found some really interesting, not only built environment resources, but also just interesting stories about the architects themselves. And then before we totally shut down, I just want to make sure that anybody who's a member or on the mailing list got a save the date card. I can't hold this the right way for some reason. In the mail over the past week or so. We are actually talking about in-person events, not immediately. We're going to look at them in the third quarter of this year. And if you did not get one of these save the date cards, please let us know. Contact me or Shelly, and we would be happy to mail you one or drop one off or what have you. But just a quick rundown of the events that we have coming up. Our first planned in-person event is at the end of August. That is going to be the City Garden, and it is historically based. City Garden Beer and Ice Cream Family Social on Sunday, August the 29th at Curran Hall. We are going to be having our tour of homes that we had to cancel last year. We're going to have it October 2nd and 3rd, and it's going to be in Petaway. And we're looking forward to that, including a brunch. We hope to have a brunch and a candlelight supper, as we traditionally do. And then our membership meeting we have scheduled for Wednesday, November 3rd at Moon Distributors again. And then a holiday social this year on December 4th, where we are going to visit 4 historic houses. And if you want more information about any of those, just stay tuned at our website, quapaw.com, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. We just had our second quarter newsletter go out with events and information, a link also to the Chronicle that I mentioned earlier. But again, thank you so much, Andrew. This was lovely, and love your little bungalow. So glad that you're here in town, and appreciate you sharing what you have found. And I know we're not supposed to, but it does make you curious about what's in your own backyard, right?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you very much.
A little bit more about our predecessors. So it's just adding more to the story, which is wonderful. So I'm going to sign off tonight. Thank everybody for coming. Again, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Shelly. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month. Take care.
Oh, Patricia, one quick thing before we go off.
Yes.
Someone asked if this is recorded. It is on YouTube Live. If you just go to YouTube and type in Quapaw Quarter Association, our page will pop up and you should find it there.
Yep, all of our preservation conversations, certainly as we've been doing them virtually, are there. So they're a great resource. So thank you very much for adding that in, Shelly. All right, I think we are good. Good night, everybody.